The sound of the plate hitting the floor was small, but it changed her life forever. It cracked once against the wood, then shattered into white pieces at Agnes Carter's feet. For a moment, the kitchen was silent. Even the clock on the wall seemed to stop ticking. Her uncle Thomas Carter looked down at the broken porcelain, then at her. His face did not show anger. That would have been easier. His face showed something worse. It showed that he had made up his mind. "This is the last thing you'll break under my roof," he said in a flat voice. He did not shout. He did not curse. He simply turned, walked to the door, opened it, and waited. It was October 17th, 1883. The wind outside already carried the promise of winter. Agnes was 19 years old. She had lived in that house since her parents died. She had worked without complaint. She had cooked, cleaned, hauled water, chopped wood. But in her uncle's world, worth was like numbers in a ledger. One mistake could erase years of effort. Her few belongings were already tied in a bundle by the porch steps. A thin quilt, one patched dress, a small knife her father once gave her, a tin cup, and $7 silver sewn into the hem of her skirt. That was all she owned. The door closed behind her with a quiet click. She did not look back. Ahead of her, the mountains rose like dark teeth against the pale sky. 7 miles uphill stood the old Summit Ridge station, abandoned years ago when the railroad changed its route. Children in town said it was haunted. Men said it was useless. But it still had a roof. And that was enough. The walk was long and silent. The air smelled of pine and iron. Snow was coming. She counted her money as she walked. $7 would buy flour, maybe salt pork, maybe nails. But it would not buy a room in town for long. And once the story spread that she had been thrown out, no one would hire her. She had only one thing left, her will. By late afternoon, she reached the station. It stood alone against the open sky, its sharp roof cutting into the gray clouds. The freight doors were missing. Most of the windows were broken. Wind moved through the empty building with a low moan. Inside, the waiting room was huge, 60 feet long, 30 feet wide. The ceiling soared high above her. Dust covered the floor. Bird nests clung to the corners. It was too big to heat, too open, too exposed. For a moment, despair crept into her chest. Then she saw it. In the far corner, near the old ticket counter, there was a small office space. 3 solid walls still stood. The fourth side was open to the main room. It was no more than 10 by 12 feet. It was small. It was defined. It could be closed in. An idea formed in her mind. She could not heat the station, but she could build something inside it. A small cabin within the shell. The station would block the worst of the wind. Inside it, she would build her own walls. She placed her bundle in that corner. That was her claim. Before dark, she began pulling boards from the freight platform outside. She had only her small knife. The old nails screamed as she forced them free. Each one she saved carefully. Her hands filled with splinters. Blood marked the wood. She worked until the sun disappeared. That first night, she wrapped herself in her thin quilt and sat in the corner. The wind moved through the broken windows like a living thing. The station groaned. She did not cry. She planned. Walls. A roof. A door. She would not freeze. The next morning, she walked 4 miles down to the small town of Prospect Hill. The general store smelled of leather and coffee. Men looked at her with curiosity. They had already heard whispers. She placed her coins on the counter. "I need a handsaw," she said. "A hammer, 3-inch nails." The tools cost her almost $2. She carried them back up the mountain like treasure. The days that followed became a rhythm of work. First, she sealed the station's broken windows. Large boards covered the biggest holes. Smaller gaps she patched with woven branches and mud mixed with dried grass. The wind still came, but weaker now. Then she began building her inner cabin. Board by board, nail by nail, she shaped a small box inside the corner office. It was 8 feet wide and 10 feet long. The roof slanted low. She left a small square opening at the top, hoping one day it would hold a stovepipe. She filled the spaces between her cabin and the station walls with moss, pine needles, and scraps of old canvas she found buried under dust. It was slow work. Hard work. But every nail she drove felt like victory. People riding past began to notice. They saw her dragging wood, climbing beams, patching walls. Laughter carried from town. They called her the station sparrow, said she was building a nest in a ruin. She did not answer them. Winter answered for her. In early November, the first storm hit. It lasted 3 days. Snow did not fall gently. It came sideways, driven by a biting wind. Temperatures dropped far below zero. The world outside disappeared into white. Agnes stayed inside her half-finished cabin. The outer station shook, but it held. The wind that reached her was weaker, still deadly, but weaker. Her breath froze in the air. She had a small sack of flour and a piece of salt pork. On the second day, she lit a tiny fire on a sheet of metal inside her cabin. Smoke filled the room. Tears ran down her cheeks from the sting. But the fire gave heat. Then she saw the damage. Rats had torn into her flour sack. The pork was chewed and ruined. For one long moment, fear wrapped around her throat. She could see herself starving. But fear passed. She found the hole where the rats entered and sealed it with stone and mud. Then she carved a trap from memory, using skills her father once taught her. When the storm ended, she set traps in the snow. The world was silent and white. She would not leave. She would build. And the winter had only begun. The first trap snapped shut before sunrise. Agnes heard it from inside her cabin, a sharp crack that echoed faintly through the frozen station. She grabbed her coat and stepped into the white silence outside. Snow reached almost to her knees. The air burned her lungs. Inside the trap was a snowshoe hare. It was small, thin, but it was life. She carried it back inside and worked quickly. Her fingers were stiff with cold, but she cleaned and skinned it with steady hands. That night, strips of meat sizzled over her small fire. The smell filled her cabin. It tasted like victory. The second trap caught a grouse 2 days later. The third held another hare. The meat was lean, but it kept her standing. The pelts she stretched carefully over frames made from willow branches. She scraped them clean with a flat stone and dried them near the fire. Soon, the inside of her small cabin began to change. Rabbit fur lined the walls. The air felt less sharp, less cruel. Food meant survival. Pelts meant trade. When she had enough cured hides bundled together, she made the long walk back to Prospect Hill. Snow crunched beneath her boots. Her breath formed white clouds in the cold morning light. Men outside the saloon paused when they saw her. They expected her to look defeated. She did not. Inside the general store, Mr. Harlan Boone raised an eyebrow when she laid the pelts on his counter. He picked one up, running his thumb across the fur. His expression shifted. "These are done right," he said slowly. "Didn't expect that." Agnes met his eyes without blinking. "The cold keeps you focused," she replied. He gave her store credit instead of coins. With that credit, she bought flour, dried beans, and the most important thing she would ever own: a small potbelly, cast-iron stove. It was used and slightly cracked at one leg, but it was solid. It cost nearly all her credit. Mr. Boone's son helped her load it onto a small handcart. She pulled it up the mountain herself. Every step was heavy. Every step was hope. Installing the stove inside her cabin took an entire day. She cut a proper hole through her cabin roof, then another through the high roof of the station. Climbing the old beams made her hands tremble. One wrong step would mean a broken neck. She shaped a stovepipe from discarded tin signs she found in the freight room. Bent metal, hammered seams, careful fitting. When she finally lit the first fire inside the stove, something changed. The iron glowed deep red. Warmth filled the cabin slowly but surely. The frost on the inside walls began to melt. Water dripped onto the floorboards. Agnes sat on her simple cot and held her hands toward the heat. For the first time since October, she felt safe. But safety had limits. The stove burned hot and fast. Wood disappeared quickly. When the fire died during the night, the cold crept back like a silent thief. By early morning, the cabin was nearly freezing again. She needed more than fire. She needed a way to hold it. The answer came by accident. One afternoon, she walked to the creek a quarter-mile from the station. Most of it was frozen solid. But in one place, steam rose from between the rocks. A small hot spring bubbled quietly beneath the ice. The stones around it were bare of snow. She placed her hand on one of the large river stones. It was warm. The stone held heat. She stood there for a long time, staring at the rocks. The idea formed slowly but clearly. Wood burns and is gone. Stone absorbs and gives back. If she built a thick wall of stone behind the stove inside her cabin, it would soak up the heat while the fire burned. Then, through the night, it would release that warmth back into the room. It would turn her cabin into something stronger. The next morning, she began. Near the old tracks, she found a broken wheelbarrow. She repaired the wheel with wood and leather strips. Then she began hauling river stones from the creek. Load after load. The weight was brutal. The path uphill felt twice as long now. Her shoulders burned. Her hands cracked and bled from the cold. Men riding past shook their heads. "She's lost her mind," one said, building a grave out of rock. Another laughed. Agnes did not answer. Inside her cabin, she mixed clay from the creek bank with sand and water. It became thick mortar. Slowly, she laid the stones behind the stove, one by one. The wall grew a foot thick and 6 feet high. Each stone had to fit tight. Each gap filled with clay. It took 2 full weeks. When the wall was finished, she stepped back and studied it. It looked simple, solid, permanent. That night, she fed the stove with extra wood. Flames roared inside the iron belly. The stone wall grew warm, then hot. Before sleeping, she let the fire die down. She waited. The cabin did not freeze. Instead, the stones began to give back what they had taken. A steady warmth filled the small space. She woke at dawn and checked the air with her breath. It did not fog. Outside, it was 4 degrees below zero. Inside, it was comfortable. She had trapped fire and stone. Word spread quickly. The station sparrow was no longer a joke. People began to speak of her with confusion instead of laughter. Some even with respect. One Saturday afternoon, a group of ranchers rode up to the station. They dismounted and stepped inside, boots heavy on the wooden floor. Agnes stood in the doorway of her cabin. Smoke curled from her tin chimney. An older rancher named Mr. Peterson cleared his throat. "They say it's warm in there," he said. "How's that possible?" Agnes stepped aside slightly so they could see the stone wall. "The stove heats the rock," she said calmly. "The rock holds the heat." The men looked at each other. They understood barns. They understood fireplaces that swallowed wood. They did not understand this. They left scratching their heads. A few days later, someone else came. He did not ride a horse. He walked. He was new to town. Tall, lean, clean coat. A small book tucked under his arm. "My name is Dr. Owen Clark," he said politely. "I heard about what you built. I'm not here to mock it. I'd like to understand it." No one had ever spoken to Agnes that way before. She studied him carefully. "You can come inside," she said. He stepped into the cabin and stopped. Warm air touched his face. His eyes widened slightly. They stood near the stone wall while the stove glowed softly. She explained the creek. The hot spring. The way the stones held warmth. He listened like a student. "That's thermal mass," he said finally. "It's physics. You built a radiant heat system." She did not know the words, but she knew the work. For over an hour they talked, not about gossip, not about survival stories. About ideas. For the first time since the plate broke on her uncle's kitchen floor, Agnes felt something new. Not just survival, not just strength, but recognition. And winter was still deepening. Dr. Owen Clark came back 3 days later. The wind was sharp that morning, cutting across the open valley, but he walked the 4 miles from Prospect Hill without complaint. He carried a small cloth bag and the same quiet curiosity in his eyes. Agnes was splitting wood outside the station when she saw him climbing the last stretch of hill. She did not wave. She simply watched. Most men came to stare. He came to learn. Inside her cabin, the stone wall still held warmth from the morning fire. Owen stepped in and closed the small door behind him. He paused, feeling the difference between the frozen station and the pocket of heat inside her wooden box. "It works even better than they say," he murmured. Agnes handed him a tin cup of hot water. It was plain, but it was warm. He opened his cloth bag and pulled out a small jar. "Apple preserves," he said. "A patient insisted I take more than I need." She nodded once in thanks. They sat on opposite ends of her small cabin. The stove crackled softly. Outside, the station groaned under the wind, but inside the air felt steady and calm. Owen studied the stone wall closely. He touched it with his palm. "It releases heat slowly," he said, "even after the fire dies." She nodded. "I watch the rocks by the creek," she replied. "They stay warm long after the steam fades." He smiled slightly. "You observed nature, then copied it." She shrugged. The cold was coming. I needed an answer. There was no pride in her voice, only fact. Over the next weeks, Owen became a regular visitor. Sometimes he brought books, sometimes coffee beans. Once, he carried a small bundle of cured meat. He never came empty-handed, and he never came with pity. They spoke of simple things at first: how to seal the chimney better, how to create a double window using salvaged glass to trap air between panes. Together, they built an inner frame for her small window. The draft along the floor disappeared almost completely. He showed her diagrams of stone and soil from one of his geology books. She showed him how she packed pine needles and moss into the roof to stop heat from escaping upward. "You think like an engineer," he said once. She looked at him quietly. "I think like someone who does not want to freeze." He laughed softly. The sound filled the empty station in a way no wind ever could. One afternoon, they climbed the old beams to reinforce the chimney pipe where it passed through the station roof. Ice coated the wood. Owen nearly slipped, catching himself at the last moment. "Careful, doctor," Agnes called calmly from below. "The town needs you alive." He grinned, slightly embarrassed. "Perhaps I should stick to patience instead of ladders." She almost smiled. Almost. As December deepened, so did their conversations. He spoke of cities back east, of crowded streets and lectures, of feeling trapped in rooms that had no real air. She spoke of her father teaching her to carve wood, of watching storms roll across open fields, of the silence she preferred to noise. They found common ground in unexpected places. He admired her order. Every tool inside her cabin had its place, every piece of wood stacked with care. She admired his patience. He listened more than he spoke. Their bond was not loud. It grew quietly, like stone holding heat. Then January came. On the 3rd day of the month, the sky changed. It did not begin with thunder. It began with silence. A thick gray ceiling lowered itself over the valley. Snowflakes fell heavy and wet at first. By nightfall, the wind began to howl. This was not an ordinary storm. The temperature dropped fast. The snow no longer drifted. It attacked. It came sideways, blinding and merciless. Agnes fed the stove constantly. The stone wall glowed warm behind it. The station trembled under the force of the wind, but the outer shell blocked the worst of it. She checked every board she had nailed in place, every window patch held. Outside, the world disappeared. In Prospect Hill, houses shook. Snow buried fences, then doors, then windows. Drifts climbed higher and higher. Owen stood at his clinic window, watching roofs disappear under white waves. He knew what this meant. Fuel would run out. Walls would fail. The cold would take those who were unprepared. He thought of one place that had been prepared. He gathered a group of strong men from town. "We have to reach the station," he shouted over the wind. "It's the only building built for this." Some hesitated, but desperation moves men faster than doubt. They tied ropes around their waists and moved together into the storm. The 4 miles felt like 20. Snow reached their waists in places. Wind pushed them sideways. More than once, a man nearly disappeared into a drift. When they finally reached the station, they were pale and shaking. Agnes opened the freight entrance and pulled them inside. The waiting room was bitterly cold, but still, the wind could not roar freely inside. From her small cabin, warmth spilled outward like a quiet promise. Owen's eyes met hers. He did not need to speak. She understood. They went back into the storm together, trip after trip. They brought families, children wrapped in blankets, elderly men too weak to walk alone, mothers clutching babies close to their chests. By the second night, nearly half the town crowded inside the old station. Agnes directed them calmly. "Stay near the inner wall," she instructed. "The warmth spreads from here." Quote. People pressed closer to the corner where her cabin stood. The stone wall radiated steady heat. The stove burned constantly. The station, once empty and forgotten, became a refuge. On the 3rd day, her Uncle Thomas arrived among the last group. His face was gray with cold. Pride had been stripped away by survival. He stepped into the station and stopped when he saw her. Not the clumsy girl who dropped a plate, but the woman who had built a fortress. He approached slowly. "I was wrong," he said, voice low and heavy. "I sent you into the wilderness. You built something stronger than my house ever was." Agnes looked at him without anger. "The cold was coming," she replied. "I did what was necessary." Outside, the blizzard still raged. Inside, her stone wall held steady, and the storm was not finished yet. The storm did not weaken on the 4th day. It grew worse. Snow piled higher than the station windows. The wind howled like an animal trapped between mountains. Roof beams in Prospect Hill began to crack under the weight. More than one house collapsed completely, swallowed by white silence. Inside the abandoned station, 47 souls huddled together. Men who once laughed at Agnes now sat quietly near her cabin walls. Mothers pressed children close to the warmth that radiated from the stone. Elderly ranchers who had survived decades of winters stared at the small wooden box she had built and shook their heads in disbelief. The station had become an ark. Agnes did not panic. She did not boast. She moved through the waiting room with steady purpose. She rationed food carefully. She instructed the strongest men to stack snow against the outer walls to create extra insulation. She organized shifts for feeding the stove so the fire never died. Dr. Owen Clark stayed at her side. When the fire burned too low, he added wood. When children cried, he knelt beside them with calm words. When someone grew weak, he checked their pulse and kept them moving so they would not fall asleep in the cold. The stone wall behind the stove absorbed and released heat without complaint. It had become the heart of the station. On the 5th night, the wind finally began to soften. By morning, silence fell over the valley. No one moved at first. They had grown used to the roar. When the sun finally broke through the clouds, its light poured through the cracked upper windows of the station. Dust and frost sparkled in the air. Men pushed open the freight entrance carefully. The world outside had changed. Snow lay 15 feet deep in places. Buildings in Prospect Hill were buried almost entirely. Several barns had collapsed. Fences were gone. The road to town had disappeared. If they had stayed in their houses, many would not have survived. Word spread quickly through the survivors. They looked at Agnes differently now. Not as a strange girl living in a ruin, but as the reason they were alive. Her Uncle Thomas approached her again that morning. His shoulders seemed smaller somehow. "You saved us," he said quietly. Agnes did not smile. "I built what I needed," she answered. "You chose to come." There was no bitterness in her voice, only truth. Over the next week, the townspeople worked together to dig out homes and clear paths. The station remained their gathering place while repairs began. Fires burned constantly in Agnes's stove as families returned in shifts to warm themselves. Owen organized medical care for frostbite and injuries. Agnes helped rebuild collapsed sheds. The work never stopped. But something had changed in Prospect Hill. The laughter was gone. In its place was respect. By early spring, when the snow finally melted into rushing streams, a surveyor arrived from the Union Pacific Railroad. His name was Samuel Harris. He carried notebooks and measuring tools and asked many questions. He had heard rumors about the blizzard and the abandoned station that had sheltered an entire town. He climbed the hill to see it for himself. Agnes met him outside. Owen stood beside her. Harris walked slowly around the building, studying the boarded windows and reinforced beams. Then he stepped inside the small cabin in the corner. He stopped in front of the stone wall. He tapped it lightly with his knuckles. "You built this with river stones?" he asked. "Yes," Agnes replied. "And clay mortar?" "Yes." He spent hours measuring, sketching, asking detailed questions about insulation thickness and window spacing. He wrote notes about the double-paned glass, about the moss packed into the roof, about the distance between stove and stone. "This is remarkable," he said finally. "You created a high-efficiency radiant heating system without formal training." Agnes shrugged. "The creek showed me," she said. The stones were warm. Harris nodded slowly. "Sometimes the best engineers are those who have to survive." He documented everything in his report. Months later, variations of her design began appearing in high mountain structures along the rail line. Thicker stone walls behind stoves. Double-pane windows. Packed natural insulation. They called it the Summit Ridge Core in official papers. Agnes did not care about the name. She cared that it worked. That summer, Owen asked her a question while they stood on the depot platform at sunset. "I would like to build something new," he said gently. "Not inside a ruin, but something of our own, with you." She looked at the valley below. The town was smaller now, quieter, stronger. "The winters here are long," she replied. "An extra pair of hands is useful." It was the closest she would come to a romantic answer. They married in a simple ceremony on the old platform. No grand decorations, no loud music, just neighbors who now stood with gratitude in their eyes. They did not move into town. Instead, they built a house overlooking the valley, not far from the station. Its foundation was deep, its walls thick, and at its center stood a massive hearth, built from the same dense river stones. The station was repaired but never reopened for trains. It became a public hall, a gathering place. A reminder of the winter that nearly erased Prospect Hill, and of the woman who refused to be erased. Years passed. Children grew in the house with the stone heart. Owen practiced medicine. Agnes worked the land and taught her sons and daughters how to observe the world carefully. On cold nights, she sometimes stood at her window and looked toward the dark outline of the old station on the hill. She remembered the hunger, the silence, the sound of the plate breaking on a kitchen floor. But most of all, she remembered the weight of each stone in her hands, the ache in her muscles, the quiet satisfaction of driving a nail straight and true. She had not built a fortress to prove anyone wrong. She had built it because the cold was coming, and she refused to bow to it. But one final chapter of her story remained. The last chapter of Agnes Carter's story was not written in the middle of a storm. It was written in quiet winters that followed. Years passed, and the blizzard of 1884 became legend in Prospect Hill. Children who had once huddled near her stone wall grew into strong men and women. They told their own children about the abandoned station on the hill and the small cabin built inside it. They told them about the girl who had been thrown out with $7 and a thin quilt. They told them about the fire that never died. Agnes and Owen's house stood firm through every season. Its stone hearth was larger than the wall she had first built, but the principle was the same. Fire roared in the evenings. The stone absorbed. The stone released. Warmth lingered long after the flames settled. Their home became a place people visited not just for heat, but for advice. Ranchers asked Agnes about insulating barns. Miners asked about building tighter cabins near the mountains. Even passing railroad workers stopped to see the design they had heard about in official reports. She never charged for her knowledge. She explained it simply. "Heat moves," she would say. "You either let it escape or you give it something to hold on to." Owen watched her with quiet admiration. He had studied books his entire life. She had studied survival. Together they built a life rooted in respect, not noise. Her Uncle Thomas changed too. Age softened him. Pride loosened its grip. One winter evening, years after the blizzard, he visited their home alone. He stood near the great hearth, staring into the fire. "I thought strength meant control," he admitted quietly. "Throwing you out felt like discipline. But you taught this town something I never understood." Agnes looked at him across the glow of the stones. "Strength is preparation," she replied. "Winter does not ask who deserves warmth." He nodded slowly. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not need to. Time had already rewritten the ledger. As the years passed, Agnes's hands grew rougher, her hair silvered. But her eyes never lost their sharp focus. She still walked to the creek sometimes, kneeling beside the same hot spring that had once given her the answer she needed. She would place her palm on the warm stone and close her eyes. The earth still held its heat. The station remained standing on the hill long after trains stopped passing through the region. It was repaired and strengthened, but the small inner cabin remained untouched. The townspeople refused to tear it down. They called it the Heart Room. On the 20th anniversary of the Great Blizzard, the town gathered there for a celebration. Lanterns hung from the beams. Children ran across the wooden floor. Music echoed where wind once howled. Agnes stood quietly near the stone wall inside the old cabin. It no longer needed to fight the cold the way it once had. But the stones still remembered. Owen joined her. "You never meant to build a legend," he said softly. She shook her head. "I meant to survive." He smiled. "And you did more than that." She looked around at the faces in the station. Men who once laughed at her now raised glasses in her honor. Women who had nearly frozen held their grandchildren close. The town existed because she had refused to leave. She had built a tiny cabin inside an abandoned station. And when the blizzard came to bury the town, that cabin became their shelter. That night, as lantern light flickered across the old beams, Agnes realized something she had never allowed herself to think. The broken plate had not ended her life. It had begun it. Winter would always come. Storms would always test the strong and the weak alike. But fire, once captured and guarded, could change everything. Years later, when Agnes finally passed in her sleep beside the great stone hearth in her home, the town gathered once more at the station on the hill. Snow fell lightly that day, not as an enemy, but as a reminder. They lit a fire inside the heart room and let the stone wall warm slowly. Children placed their hands against it and felt the steady heat spreading outward. They told the story again, of a girl with 7 silver dollars, of an abandoned station, of stone that held fire, and of a winter that tried to bury a town but failed, because one woman chose to build instead of bow. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs strength today, and follow for more Wild West tales of courage and survival.